Yes. Good day and welcome to the AABE Legislative Issues and Public Policy webinar. I'm Tracy Woods, Vice President of Operations for the Association and your host for today's conversation. Our topic today is Martin Luther King Jr., MLK, and energy justice. Just a few days ago, we as a nation paid tribute to the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most prominent icons of the civil rights movement. During our conversation today, we will explore how the current energy justice initiatives have their roots in the work of the late Dr. King. We've made considerable progress with becoming the nation Dr. King envisioned. I think the information on this next slide you'll see is revealing. And still, if you would, cue up the slide with the King Memorial statue. So when we look at the slide, one of the things that is revealing, at least for me, was the percentage of African Americans completing high school. In 1964, just over 25% of African Americans completed high school. This census data was taken in 2020, and we're now at 89.4%. Nearly 90% of our students complete high school. The second piece of data talks about college students, and this is really a great piece of news. 306,000 or so African-American college students graduated or were in college, and now we're at a figure, at least in 2020, of 2.85 million. Grant you that's in the throes of the pandemic. And then we look at citizen voting population, and we have some more data. So when we look at the things that have occurred between the 60s and now, significant progress. And this, again, is from the census data. Thanks for that information, Stu. So, as I mentioned, the quest for energy justice is rooted in the civil rights movement. That's because one of the persistent issues at the core of energy justice is this disparity in energy burden. Research has shown that Black, Brown, and Indigenous households pay a greater percentage of income on energy costs than white households. This difference in energy burden centers around poor housing stock. While most people are aware of Dr. King as a civil rights movement leader, fewer are familiar with the role he played in the fair housing movement. During the early 20th century, Black Americans were systemically deprived of sufficient quality housing because they were routinely and openly excluded from living in certain areas. Discrimination, intimidation, exclusion, and even violence segregated and relegated Black people to low-income areas with poor quality housing. In his role as a civil rights leader, Dr. King recognized that this reality was a core component of racial injustice in the United States, and he decided to take action in response. So from 1965 to 1966, Dr. King co-led the Chicago Freedom Movement. That was a campaign which sought to challenge discrimination in employment, education, and housing in Chicago. During that time, Chicago was one of the most residentially segregated cities in the country. Black home seekers in the city and surrounding suburbs were effectively barred from middle-class, predominantly white neighborhoods and prevented from seeking housing freely. By organizing tenants unions, sharing their demands with city government leaders, and marching through majority white neighborhoods, the Chicago Freedom Movement advocated for open housing, the right for Black Americans to buy homes anywhere they wish. One of the methods that Dr. King and civil rights advocates used to uncover discrimination in housing was testing. Testing involves one or more people covertly engaging in a transaction or interaction in order to determine whether discrimination may be occurring. So with testing, Dr. King and his cohort would send in a Black couple or individual to seek housing in discriminatory areas. Many times those testers were told that there was no housing available. At least that was the response that Black testers would get. On King's staff, he had white staffers as well. He would send them in subsequently to the same entity and ask about housing. And they were actually invited in to take a look at the housing that was available. One of the things that happened as a result of that is that in 1966, August of 66, after approximately a year of campaigning, and despite facing violence from white Chicagoans, the Chicago Freedom Movement achieved some important victories. The Chicago Housing Authority agreed to build public housing in white middle-class areas, and the Mortgage Bankers Association promised to stop discriminatory lending practices. But the most significant and far-reaching outcome of this effort was the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that was signed into law 1 week after Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. So what we call energy justice is deeply rooted in the civil rights movement. Joining me on the panel today, Araya Salter and Curtis Wynn, to discuss our topic of MLK and energy justice. So Raya is an energy and environmental law and policy consultant. She's an educator. She's actually a law school professor, and she's a member of the New York State Climate Action Council. Curtis Wynn is a recently named CEO of the Sumter Electric Co-op in Florida. He's back home now, and he's the former CEO of 27 years at the Roanoke Electric Co-op, and he is the former board chair of the NRECA, which is the National Rural Electric Co-op Association. Ryan and Curtis, welcome. And I look forward to this discussion today. So I want to open up with both of you. Same question for both of you, because in the research and the selection, you are continuing in an energy justice way the work of the civil rights movement, and since we're talking about Dr. King, very much in line with the work that he began. Would you tell us something about how Dr. King's work influenced the work that you do today? I'll start with Ryan.
Hi, thank you so much. I want to say hello to everybody. I'm thrilled to be speaking to this audience, and thank you so much for having me speak today. Really, and you saw that slide about energy justice, and I wrote a book called Energy Justice from 2018. And when I think about Dr. King, I'm an advocate, an activist, and I have spent a lot of my career working in coalition as an organizer, in particular, trying to bring my energy policy expertise to grassroots organizations as an organizer and as an activist. And when I think about organizing, and I think about the roots of energy justice being environmental justice and what that means. What that means as an attorney, the heart of that comes straight from civil rights. What is environmental justice? Equal protection using environmental laws. And when there's a disparity there, you have environmental racism. So the bedrock of energy justice, environmental justice, comes directly from civil rights law.
Appreciate that. Yeah, great. That is your work. Curtis is similar. Curtis, so how has Dr. King's work influenced the work that you've been doing?
Well, thanks for being here. This is an honor to be asked to be a part of something that is anything that has Dr. King's name attached to it. To be a part of that is quite an honor. To join you as well as Raya on this program today. When I think about it, Tracy, really Dr. King's nonviolent boldness is really a model that we should never forget as leaders in the industry and as leaders in our respective areas of energy. And I'm really most influenced by his ability to really communicate with others and to try to find common ground around issues that we're facing. And we see a lot of that in the energy industry. I've seen a lot of it personally, and it's just those are two things that really stand out for me that have influenced the way I do business and react to different circumstances as well as get along with others.
Reaching across the aisle, finding commonality. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, at the core of it is humanity, and I'm finding that both of you center your work in that. So appreciate the comment. Right, I got another question for you. because you've been in the news lately. We know that you're a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, doing some really great work. And collectively, you and your council members decided to implement the Justice 40 executive order with 40% of the investment targeting frontline and marginal EJ communities. What should we expect to see in the rest of the country? Because I know you're in concert with them. So.
Now, this is a great question, one of my favorite things to speak on. And so what I want everybody in this audience to know and understand is that the Federal Justice 40 Initiative, which is the Biden administration's commitment through executive order to allocate 40% of spending to disadvantaged communities, as Tracy elaborated, started in New York State. In 2019, grassroots advocates passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And in that was a New York State commitment of that 40% of spending. And from that statute came the creation of this Climate Action Council that I've been appointed to. And we have just approved the scoping plan for how New York State will reach our nation leading climate goals. So and a piece of that in New York State is how that's happened is the statute also created a climate justice working group that is tasked with determining the criteria for who is a disadvantaged community. That group is made up of environmental justice advocates and others. And they have been working and are just releasing that criteria. So the story is New York State was the originator of this Justice 40 idea, and we have been implementing it and we are implementing that now in New York State. The feds are working on that as well. What can you expect in New York State? In New York State, we can expect and demand, and that's what's important for the federal work and the state work. We need to be looking for it, knowing that it's there, and demanding that there's an actual redirect frame. 40% of climate spending must benefit disadvantaged communities. This should mean, if we demand it, actual change in dollars that are going to folks who qualify for that, and I could speak to that another time, or further if you like. On the federal level, there's the same initiative that is creeping forward. And what we will expect there is a report card in February from the federal government on how they are doing to implement the Justice 40. But it's much different. And it's also tied up in the infrastructure bill and this Build Back Better Act that Manchin is kind of tanked. So there's a little more I can speak to on the Justice 40 on the federal level, but I'll stop there for now.
All right. So yeah, part of what I got, that report card next month. And so we are looking for that. It will have been about a year since the executive order. And so, yeah, certainly looking at that report card. But yeah, the work that you're doing in New York State, appreciate that. Great. So Kurt, question for Curtis. We mentioned in your introduction that now you're at what's called CECO Co-op in Florida, having been at Roanoke Electric Co-op for nearly 3 decades. And you've written extensively about DEI and its importance in your service delivery. We saw quite a bit of writing in your post, as you left Roanoke. So what are some of the challenges of bringing a DEI initiative in a rural community? And what has to be done differently to enact that? You're still muted, I think.
I'll just reflect on my 2-year. This wouldn't be a webinar without someone having to be placed off of mute. So I'm your guy.
No worries.
2019, 2021, yes, I had the extremely exciting opportunity to be president of the board of the National Trade Association. And I just recall pivoting about halfway through my term from a platform that was basically encouraging co-ops to adopt and adapt to this rapid pace of change in the industry. And it is moving at a very rapid pace, and we worry about who's going to be able to keep up and who's going to be left out of the equation. But I recall, and all of us recall, that about halfway through my term, the nation was on the front end of all kinds of divisiveness that was beginning to bubble up, stemming from a number of unjust acts that were happening all around the nation. And, corporate leaders were being very intentional about declaring that the acts that you see on the television are not reflective of our organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And it just compelled me as the first African-American board president of America's Electric Co-ops to speak up in a meaningful way that would extend well beyond not only the turmoil, but my term as president of NRECA. So I worked with some very close cooperative colleagues and the NRECA staff, and we put forth a member resolution encouraging the National Trade Association to come up with a strategy around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hear a lot about that, and we did. We were able to get a resolution passed by the whole membership. Some 900 cooperatives across the nation got behind a DEI resolution for all co-ops. And of course, it basically talks about where do we come from as co-ops in the beginning. When we talk about this, the cooperative movement was, in fact, a DEI movement. It just came in a different form. Farmers, ranchers, people in the very rural parts of this country did not have access to electricity. So they were the ones who were left out of the equation. And now today, if you fast forward, there is no difference today between what happened in the 1930s and what we're seeing happening today in this energy transformation that we're going through. So the resolution itself basically is urging cooperatives to go back to the ideals of DEI that got us started, and to understand that this is what I think is different and that's critical that we understand is that incorporating DEI, and for the members to do that, it does create value. It creates business advantages that we would not otherwise have if we'd left it out of the equation. It could mean greater member satisfaction. It could also mean increased engagement by the members and lower costs to them in terms of rates. So another part of that was to take action, create a business case. And I want to share that with you after this is over. You might want to share it with the audience, but there is a business case that was supported and put into action, along with putting some frameworks in place that individual co-ops could actually put into action. I'm happy to say that today, a couple of years after this resolution was passed, actually only about a year and a half, and someone we all are very familiar with, I want to pin a rose on this person because when this resolution began to get traction, I reached out to our colleague, Rose McKinney James, who we all know, most of us know, who really stepped in and at that time as chair of Energy Foundation and supported us getting a consultant to work on the business case, to actually everything that's in the resolution that you'll see. We've actually been through Rose's support and the support of a diversity consultant, the Gatling Agency, to put all of this in place. Now today, if you fast forward to where we are today, we have put business frameworks, DEI frameworks, in about 10 co-ops, including the one where I used to work. And we will soon have one where I'm working today that gives a roadmap of how a co-op can move from where they are to having a sustainable diversity, equity, and inclusion plan to get them to a better place. And that includes a lot of in looking at a lot of the injustices that we see today, that we're talking about today, recognizing those and putting something in place to get that taken care of. So going back to your question, so what can we do? Basically, the short answer is that after all of this work and after speaking at numerous speaking engagements, what I believe is the biggest challenge is understanding what DEI is. I think if you ask 15 people what it is, you might very easily get 15 different answers. So one of the biggest challenges with co-ops is demystifying what it is, because as you bring up the subject, that's the first question I get. Well, Curtis, what exactly are we trying to accomplish with it? So I think a strong educational approach to open it up to the broader sense of what DEI is and getting folks to buy into what it is. And then secondly, after knowing what it is, how do you bring this to a business imperative and to a point where where leaders of co-ops understand that this can help my bottom line. I don't run into very many people who are not interested in doing that. So that is what I believe are the two biggest challenges is one, demystifying what it is. Number two, figuring out a roadmap to get us from point A to point B. And I'm very happy to say that we are gaining traction to get that moving in the right direction because of a resolution and the support by Energy Foundation.
Right. Yeah, fantastic. You know, everywhere I turn, someone's mentioning Rose McKinney James, personal shero, professionally. You know, at one point, Curtis, you're aware, and the audience mainly is aware that at one point, Rose was the chair of our board, but just doing tireless work, you know, across the spectrum. So I didn't know that. So that's really great to know. One of the things that I think is important is that, you know, there are co-ops in 48 states, which I am constantly reminded of. So in some of your writing, I saw that said 48 states, you know, that's a big footprint. So thank you for that, Curtis. Raya's back up. Here's a question, Raya, for you. And you can certainly educate us on this, right? Because there's a recent proposal to limit or ban natural gas infrastructure in new construction in New York City. I think that's right. The question is, how do we balance those type of legislative proposals with what we know about energy burden in our communities?
You know, New York State really is ground zero in a lot of ways for, I think what activists would go ahead and say is, you know, the fight against fossil gas. And I know, look, not everyone on this call, I'm sure there are plenty of folks who are gas executives on this call, and that's all right. As an activist and as other activists in New York State have worked really hard and are working really hard, not only to shut down fracking, shut down the natural gas infrastructure, and really, you know, make that change. And in New York State, when we look at our greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at the buildings, we're looking at the greatest city in the world, New York City, right? and all those buildings, and it goes directly at this issue that you were speaking of. Pause again, the New York State climate law. So we need to be at 100% renewable energy by 2040 in New York State, 70% by 2030. So we have ambitious goals to move off of the fossil gas system. We also, however, and this is why the New York climate law is so unique and so important, because it was powered by grassroots environmental justice advocates. The law states that no contract, no permit can be granted if it creates a disproportionate burden to disadvantaged communities. And the actions we do on clean energy must prioritize emissions reductions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities. So this is the no harm piece that's missing in our federal Justice 40 work. This piece of we are doing, but we also must not do harm. So there are a few things more sensitive, you know, in energy than looking at what the impact will be on rates. And energy burden is a big piece of that. And so I think nothing that while the fossil fuel industry, again, speaking as a climate activist, as the fossil fuel industry, you know, the first thing when they hear about ambitious goals is to talk about cost. You think the fossil fuel industry were the biggest consumer advocates out here. But the advocates are also keenly aware of the importance of centering environmental justice in everything we do for a just transition. So we cannot move forward on this if it's going to increase energy burden in a negative way. And that's why what we need to see is more, I mean, and this is from the federal government as well, and every state. I don't know any state that feels like they have enough money.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, you know what? Centering on energy burden, focusing on energy burden, the balance appreciate your comments on that. And I know, as a part of the Climate Action Council, you spend the time, with the challenging conversations, so kudos to what's going on in New York, and you're leading in many ways. And so it's helpful for our audience to hear from you and the work that you're doing. So fantastic. Let's see. I'm looking at the time. There's a Curtis question. Curtis, because you've made this transition, right? You've made this transition from Roanoke to SECO as a co-op, right? And there's this tradition of the outgoing, well, at least at the U.S. presidential level, the outgoing president leaves a note in the desk for the incoming or inaugurated president, right? I'm not sure what you did when you left Roanoke, but did read some of your conversation in the blog. You did a blog post. So you may have touched on it before. What prompted some of those comments specific to Roanoke?
Yeah, and some of that, I think the blog that you're referring to, Tracy, is one that speaks about a lot of the work that we were doing at Roanoke Electric had some tie-in or relationship to DEI. I think, is that the one that you're talking about?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So if you go back to when I got started in 1997, actually I was there about 24 years, and it really, the work that we've done was really influenced by the guy who hired me. I'll share another very influential person, since we're celebrating Dr. King's holiday, and Matthew Grant. I'll go ahead and share. He was the board president at Roanoke Electric in '97 when the board hired me. And when I look at this gentleman and how he, as a farmer, a small business person, he really epitomizes what DEI is and what so many are aspiring to be. He had a very quiet persona. He pressed himself onto the board of Roanoke Electric as the first African American. He didn't stop there. He recruited 4 other African Americans until there was a minority board compensation. And when the job opportunity came up, his statement was that we are going to be intentional about hiring an African American to be our next CEO. And he probably didn't blink when he said it. So Matthew Grant, he basically walked a walk. And as I moved through those 24 years at Roanoke, putting in things like energy efficiency programs, making sure that electronics and advanced metering infrastructure was available for all of the members, who, by the way, had a demographic of mostly folks who live, about 35% of whom live below the poverty level. And as you mentioned in the opening statements, who had housing issues, where they were seeing electric bills on days like today, in other places, I'll have to say. On days like today, where the temperature is down in the 20s, I would see people coming through the lobby with bills of $500 per month. And knowing that there was no ability to do that. So Mr. Grant understood that, and they wanted someone who would come in and really be sensitive to those things. And we had a board that was sensitive to those issues. So when we're talking about this subject today in terms of energy burdens, energy equality, inequality, I lived it for 24 years. And what you saw in the paper and what we talked about in the programs that now my successor, who is also an African American, and Marshall Cherry, who's now running the cooperative, it was important for me to pay it forward, just as Mr. Grant paid it forward to me. And now we have yet another African-American who is the CEO of a co-op, which they're not enough, but they're at least there's one more. And so and by the way, Marshall was the co-author of a lot of these programs because we locked step several years ago to make sure we put things in place that were needed by the membership. We operated like an electric cooperative owned by the folks we serve as a utility. And much of what was in there was really a testament to what Mr. Grant instilled in me. And Marshall and I worked on together. And I think it's for the benefit of the members to have energy efficiency programs, to have the ability to charge their electric vehicles in their home if they choose to do so, or for African-American landowners to protect their land. So I didn't have it in an envelope. It was written by the guy who took my place, because we walked in lockstep to put that together, and influenced by a gentleman that I just really still have so much respect for, even though he's passed away by now.
All right. Appreciate that, Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant, wow. Yeah, they are, folks who've paved the way. So quite a tribute. quite a visionary person, I would say. One more, for Ryan, one more question. And what Curtis just mentioned about Mr. Grant caused me to think about Dr. Robert Bullard, who's been described by many as a father of environmental justice movement, father of the movement. So he wrote the foreword to your book. We talked about your book a little bit, not as much as we need, but Energy Justice. You have a book, Energy Justice, U.S. and International Perspectives, and a foreword by Dr. Bullard. So share with us what inspired you to choose Dr. Bullard for that foreword in your most recent book.
No, absolutely. And I really, I encourage everyone, if you haven't heard of it, I'm sure many people on the call perhaps have heard of Dr. Bullard. If you haven't heard of Dr. Bullard, go ahead and Google him, and you can, I think he's even got drbullard.com or something like that. And yes, he is known as the father of environmental justice. And he is just, and he's based in Houston, Texas. And he is a brilliant activist and scholar who really pioneered a lot of the environmental justice scholarship, and really is a movement elder. And he's still very much around. And actually, I spent some time with him in Glasgow. He was in Glasgow, Scotland for the COP26 meeting. And something that's really important in movements, and again, this makes me think of why we're here today, we're talking about Dr. King, is that we always need to be, and this movement is about the young people. Movements are always about the young people. Everything we do is ultimately about the youth and the young people. We love our young people. Actually, I call myself Climate Auntie, and that's where you can find me on Instagram. But we always, in movements, we have to remember that intergenerational organizing is important. And we also have to just acknowledge those who have come before us, like Dr. King, deeply acknowledge their contributions. We lose much more than folks could. I can't say enough what we lose when we walk in thinking that we're going to reinvent the wheel, that folks haven't paved these paths before us, because we lose everything. Basically, we lose everything that they fought for, and thinking we're just going to do it all over again. And so honoring those who are our elders, our movement elders, is something that's really important, and their knowledge. And he's just a really cool person. And it was really my honor and privilege to be able to have Dr. Bullard and his work in advocacy, be a part of my story of advocacy. One other thing I'll say about Dr. Bullard and the environmental justice advocates who work with him, and all the environmental justice advocates more broadly, it is an under-recognized and underappreciated fight. And I really encourage folks who are listening, if you don't know a lot about environmental justice, go ahead on Google it, find out, Google Cancer Alley, understand what's happening in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Texas, and the fights that are happening. Black people are more likely to be impacted by pollution from every single source than whites and other people of color. And other people of color also. This is, the studies tell us again and again and again. And so these are unheralded and under-recognized fights that folks like Dr. Bullard are leading against the petrochemical industry, against the oil and extractive industry and the refineries that are poisoning millions and millions of Black people in the United States. So take a Google, read up on read up on Dr. Bullard, read up on environmental justice.
All right. Climate Auntie, yes.
Climate Auntie.
When we first connected, I believe it was on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's what was it caught my attention. Climate Auntie, I grant you, I've seen you presented in other places. So appreciate that you're here. For the audience, I'm cognizant of the time. We've got, 17 minutes left. So one of the things I wanted to do is remind you that we take the last 15 minutes or so, if we can, for Q&A. So I've been checking the Q&A a little bit, and I want to encourage the audience to take advantage of that. I'm sure you've been holding your questions. I know you've got some. I've got plenty. So leverage the Q&A. And then, Stu, if you would, there is a slide. I want to share this just a little bit, and it will go into this slide or talk about this slide after the audience gets to see it. There's a slide for just transition. Okay, because, I'm sure there are folks in the audience and saying, I hear justice as a part of the terminology, but we've talked already today about environmental justice. We've talked about climate justice, and we talked about the topic of discussion was energy justice. And are they different? Are they related? How are they related? And I saw this slide earlier on, and I thought this was helpful in terms of at least visualizing the justice initiatives that we've talked about today and how they're interrelated. And so we talked about the civil rights movement, and descending, I guess, from the civil rights movement was the environmental justice movement. If we think about that movement, what has followed that is the whole movement around climate justice, as we become aware of climate change and the impacts on humanity. And one of the biggest drivers, of course, around climate justice is energy. And so as we globally look at energy sources and how to address the impacts of those energy sources, now we get to that justice conversation with energy justice. And they're all interrelated. And I think this graph can be helpful where we talk about a just transition from the environmental justice, climate justice issues, and energy justice issues to a clean energy global transition. So how do we make that transition in an equitable or just way? So, hey, Stu, thanks for that slide. I'm hopeful that that'll frame our conversation for the next couple of minutes. And when I talk to Ryan later on and Curtis, they'll let me know whether I did well or failed on that one. But
I was going to say, did you take that from my law school teaching deck? Because that slide was excellent, and your explanation was excellent too.
Hey, I appreciate you. Thank you.
Leave my deck alone. That's proprietary.
Right. And as an attorney, I need to give credit, right? Yes, indeed. One question before we go to Q&A. But as again, we talked about this just transition. So two-part question for you and Curtis collectively. So what are the policy and practical solutions required to ensure in the just transition that Black and brown communities are not left behind? And then I want to zero in and say, what should we as an association of industry professionals, AABE, what should we be doing? So ladies first.
All right. Thank you. Excellent question. And I think from that, in that environmental justice, climate justice frame, energy justice frame are really important, because we have to focus as we are investing in energy. We need to focus on cleaning up environmental injustice sites, and that's a historical cumulative impact, piece. It has to be cleaned up and we need to be focusing on cleaning up air and prioritizing those emissions and co-pollutant reductions in quote unquote disadvantaged communities. So that's that piece that we're doing in New York. We have to focus, and then the money, right? I call that climate justice, in terms of we need to focus the resources on those who have done the least to create climate change and yet are suffering its impacts first and worst. We need to focus the resources on those who need it most. We need to focus on the cleanup, on the environmental injustice, what that is being caused. So yes, and we have to at the same time do no harm. And that is the approach that we are trying to take, or we're working towards in New York State.
Right. First, do no harm. Sounds medical, but it's important, in the work that you both are doing.
Look, in the infrastructure bill and in the bills that have passed, one of the things that we've seen on the federal level are NEPA rollbacks, and that is how, communities, when we're citing these things, like how are communities engaged, what is that analysis about do no harm? And so, that piece of if we let go on spending, great, we're going to go do all this stuff, but how's it going to be done? How are we going to make a change in how it's been done to how it needs to be done?
So Curtis, same question. What do you see as policy and practical solutions required to ensure, our Black and Brown communities are not left behind, and then specifically for AABE?
Let me stick with what I know best, and that is more on the practical side. I mentioned earlier, we're in an energy transformation period right now. Things have really come full circle. When we were first privileged to have electricity, everything was generated close to the home, close to where the consumption was. And we transitioned, we were looking at bulk power systems that were traveling along transmission facilities to get to the utility that distributed out to the end consumer. Now, where are we? We're right back where we started. People are wanting rooftop solar, batteries. They want to have bidirectional charging capabilities with their vehicles so that they can have another source, but quite frankly, they want to unplug from the utility. And that is where things are going. And that really scares me even more about this folks who are left out of that equation. And central to that equation, Tracy, is communications. So one policy area that I think is critically important, we hear a lot about today, and that is connectivity. If we think the digital divide is bad today, wait and see what happens when the digital divide includes folks being left out of the electrical transformation process, who cannot have smart thermostats in their homes, who cannot have connectivity to communicate and allow them to have the new, more modern forms of generating and distributing electricity close to the meter. That's going to be very costly for those who can't make that transition. So you take the energy burden that's there now, I think you could expand it 3 or 4-fold once that happens, and folks who are left on the outside looking in are trying to be a part of that. The irony of all of this is that to leave anyone out of the energy transformation equation is costly to the utility. So it behooves the utility to make sure that no one's left out of that equation as we transform into a new environment. So that's not really a lot to do with policy or anything, but I think just from a practical business perspective, it is incumbent, I believe, on the utility to make sure we bring everyone forward. And we have to get connectivity through broadband. There's a lot of emphasis about getting broadband to rural areas. And it's if it was ever needed, it's needed now for the rural energy consumer to keep up with what's happening in terms of change in the industry.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think, when you talk about connectivity and broadband to rural, and particularly the lessons learned in, in COVID-19, the pandemic, and how important it was. It has been, I say was, we're not through. But, the connectivity and, recently in the news, we see 5G and, there are communities that are anticipating and enjoying 5G. And then we have other communities not so fortunate. So excellent point. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. It's informative for our audience. Got about, I don't know, 5 minutes. And here's a question. So now the audience's questions, right? Here's an audience question, right? In making a just transition, what has to happen so our communities are ready to participate in electrification, beneficial electrification, I guess, electric vehicles, the clean energy transition? What has to happen at the community level? Back to Raya, then we'll loop in Curtis.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, what Curtis said about connectivity is so incredibly important.
Great, all right.
There are a lot of things, a lot of things that need to happen. And I'm going back to your slide when you talked about what is energy justice, and you had those circles, and they were talking about procedural justice and restorative justice and the components of that. And so one component really is, communities need to be involved in the decision making on what happens with the energy and related infrastructure. There needs to be a lot more communication in education. And we need, again, this piece about real resource dedication. And another big part of that resource allocation, as the activist world will tell you, is community-based solutions. Giving funds to communities to implement solutions. There are many organizations in New York State and throughout the country who've come together and have done, just infrastructure planning, who have plans on how they can do be it energy efficiency, be it community renewables. They've got plans to do this. They want to do this. What do they need? Funding. They need to participate at all levels. And that means both as business entities and also broader participation, because that piece that Curtis was talking about in terms of folks getting left behind on clean energy is already, is already off to the races and happening in terms of wealthier folks taking advantage of clean energy. And we don't want folks to be left behind and paying more of a burden for the system. So there's so many things to talk about there, but I'll stop there.
All right. This one is for both of you, although, and here's my thinking. One, Curtis is back in Florida now, and Florida's a destination. He kind of mentioned earlier, Ryan, how, some of us were in the cold, being in DC and New York, you and I, and how he was, in warmer climes in Florida. But COP26 comes to mind as something that, Ryan, I know that you made public comments about that. You actually rated it on a 10 scale, from 1 to 10. And so, would you share your ratings and the why of your ratings? And I'm sure Curtis can weigh in on this, but so.
Yes, and you're referring to when I was in Scotland, I was asked to speak to a Great Britain morning news program, and always looking for the hot take. They said, "What would be your rating of COP?" And I said, "I think, what does the meme on TikTok go? Saying, I can't give you a 0, so I'll give you a 1." And the 1 is all that COP got. Activist community, hugely disappointed by COP. No real action or commitments of the type that we'd like to see. We did get a deforestation pledge. We got a methane reductions pledge. But in terms of concrete action on how we're going to get off of fossil fuels and how we're going to stop global warming, we didn't really see progress on that. And that was the reason for my low ratings.
Your low rating, right? 1 out of 10. Yeah, it grabbed attention, certainly. And see, Curtis is a practical, again, when we look at the work you've done, I know you're tracking things like that. Curtis, about Florida, right? What are you finding You've been there for a little bit. What keeps you up at night? Let me ask you about that.
Yeah, well, I've transformed, I guess, if you could say, in terms of actions, moving from a place where there was negative growth and very high percentages of folks who were living below the median income level, and having a focus on trying to serve that membership, to one in which now the growth rate here is, in some years, we're picking up as many people on our system as we had total at Roanoke. But the reality of it is still this. And one of my colleagues teased me when I announced I was coming here. We have a lot of retirees that are moving to the area. Central Florida is growing like crazy. There's land. Folks are leaving the north, leaving the west, and coming right here. But there still are those folks who are having issues and are suffering from energy burdens. So that's in my DNA to really, while we manage the growth, we manage everything that's happening from a utility perspective, it can't get out of my system the fact that we still have folks who are having a hard time paying their electric bill. So balancing that with a new demographic that has a little bit of both, it's going to be pretty tricky to see how we can blend those two together. But I think there are some real major opportunities in doing so. But that is the big contrast that I'm seeing right now in terms of the differences between the two locations.
I'm looking at the time. We're out of time. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure, with the things that both of you are doing. I wanted to thank you, Rye and Curtis, for spending time with our AABE audience this afternoon. I also want to thank you for the work that you're doing to impact not only the culture, and you certainly are doing that, but the nation. And when we look at how we are centered or how we are impacted, it's a global impact. So I want to thank you for taking the time and wish you both a great afternoon. And for our audience, good afternoon. And we'll see you again next month.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.